Brian Wilson's Inferiority Complex, an Adlerian analysis. Brian was born in 1942 and grew up in suburban Southern California, the eldest of three brothers. In his teens, Brian put a pop vocal band together consisting of himself as vocalist, bassist, songwriter, and leader, his cousin Mike Love as a lead vocalist, brother Dennis on vocals and drums, brother Carl on vocals and guitar, and family friend Al Jardine on vocals and guitar. By the time he was 21 years old, Brian's band, the Beach Boys, were one of the biggest touring and recording acts in America. Yet, by the end of the 60s, Brian had become mentally unstable. And by the late 1970s, Brian was grossly overweight, swimming in debt, divorced, depressed, paranoid, suicidal, addicted to alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, and cocaine, and he was frequently in and out of psychiatric hospitals. At his low point in 1978, he was living as a vagrant in a public park until he was arrested by the San Diego police and hospitalized for alcohol poisoning. How could such a talented and successful man suffer from so many problems that all seem to stem from low self-esteem and personal feelings of worthlessness and shame? Perhaps Alfred Adler's construct of the inferiority complex could shed light on Brian Wilson's neuroses. Dennis Wilson said of his father, Murry, "He just had a very unique way of expressing himself physically with his kids. That asshole would beat the shit out of us." "I was 5 or 6, Dennis recalled, and I was playing with matches on the curtain, little balls of lint, and they'd go phoom. The punishment for that was he burned my hands with the matches. He was brutal." Each of the three Wilson boys learned to deal with the abuse in their own way. Carl, the youngest, adapted to his abusive household by hiding from his dad and hiding from conflict in general. In hiding from his problems, he learned to internalize his anxiety, compensating for the stress by eating, drinking, and smoking. As a result, Carl was perpetually overweight his whole life and became a chain-smoking alcoholic. He died of lung cancer at the age of 51. Dennis adapted to the abuse by fighting back, externalizing the angst and rage that grew inside of him every time he was hit by Murry. He fought his dad, he fought his brothers, he fought his cousin Mike Love, he fought his many girlfriends and wives, but most of all, he fought himself. Between his rampant drug use and his belligerent behavior, he eventually found himself alienated from everyone who loved him. He was kicked out of the Beach Boys several times, divorced multiple times, and estranged from all of his children. Getting lost and hard drugs and decadence found him consorting with people of ill repute. A bar fight in the early 1970s, along with all the drugs, tobacco, and alcohol, irreparably damaged his greatest asset, his beautiful singing voice. In 1983, Dennis was once again banned from the Beach Boys, broke and homeless. He spent Christmas Eve at a substance abuse treatment center, but then checked himself out on Christmas Day and went on a bender, getting in a bar fight that landed him in the hospital. On December 28th, after drinking all day, he went to the marina where the beloved yacht he once owned was moored. The boat had been repossessed by the bank. He dove into the icy waters, reportedly to find something he tossed off his yacht years earlier. Dennis never found what he was looking for. He drowned and died at the age of 39. "Kids who get hit don't turn into one thing," Brian wrote. "Dennis turned into one thing, and Carl turned into another thing, and I turned into a third thing." Known for having one of the greatest ears in music history, the ear that created the legendary Beach Boys' Southern California sound, Brian could not hear a thing out of his right ear. Brian blamed his semi-deafness on Murry, attributing it to either carelessness on Murray's part, saying, "He even dropped me in my infancy on the concrete sidewalk outside our apartment. It's possible I suffered brain damage as a result." or sometimes to Murray's abusiveness. Whether the deafness was a result of a birth defect, Brian wrote, or one of my dad's early beatings has been lost and buried among my family's many skeletons. Brian wrote, Dad instilled in me a predisposition to mental illness that left me a cripple. Brian recalls how his father would tie him to a tree for punishment, and how his father, after catching him masturbating, made him go without dinner for 2 nights. One particularly vicious punishment stands out in Brian's mind. With a splintered 2x4, he delivered blows to my back and midsection, standing over me, a giant with a giant weapon, swinging it over and over as if truly delighted by the dull thud it made against my torso. Brian's high school music teacher, Fred Morgan, reported that he saw Murray hit Brian in the head with a baseball bat at Little League practice. Though Brian was a star athlete in high school, his playing was never good enough for Murray, who would scream at his son from the sidelines and after the game, "You're no good, you're lazy, you don't concentrate, you might as well quit now, might as well face up to being a loser." A particularly sadistic and vicious punishment, retold by Brian in a 1991 autobiography, reveals the psychological torture and cruelty at play in Murray's parenting. Suddenly, my dad threw a folded newspaper on the floor, opened it, and ordered me to take a shit, right there, on the paper. I was petrified and began heaving with rasping sobs. I looked up toward my dad's menacing face with red eyes that pleaded to be forgiven for whatever misdeed I'd committed. I wanted to be excused, hit, anything but what he was asking me to do. "Now," he commanded. Afterward, he made me look. While my mother had looked on, my own father had robbed me of my self-esteem. He had raped me. I've never forgotten about this incident. I was scarred for life. The anger has never gone away. Brian dealt with the abuse by compensation, Adler's term for dealing with the feeling of inferiority by focusing our efforts in areas where we can succeed. From early childhood on, Brian said, music defined my life. It was the core to my existence. The way I communicated, thought, worked out my troubles, shared my happiness. I heard it in my head, a 24-hour radio station that played even in my sleep. My father had abused and beaten me during childhood and had made me afraid of people, Brian recalled. Music was a safe place within Brian where he could retreat. Brian often spoke about the true start of the Beach Boys. In the evenings, as the boys lied in bed in their shared bedroom, traumatized by recent abuse or terrified of imminent abuse, Brian would get them singing softly, and they would harmonize in bed, finding peace and tranquility. Those nights of singing their blues away in their room, Brian explained, was the inspiration for the famous Beach Boys song that he composed and co-wrote in 1963. There's a world where I can go and tell my secrets too, in my room. In this world, I lock out all my worries and my fears, in my room, in my room. My dad was an asshole, Dennis Wilson explained. He treated us like shit and his punishments were sick. But you played a tune for him and he was a marshmallow. This mean motherfucker would cry with bliss like the lion in The Wizard of Oz when he heard the music. Through music, Brian could compensate for his feelings of inferiority by focusing on something that made him feel superior, accepted, and worthy of his father's praise. If I could make music, Brian reasoned, perhaps my dad would show me the love I craved. Everyone, Alfred Adler explained, feels inferior to others in some way. The healthy way to deal with feelings of inferiority is to compensate by focusing on things that you're good at, like music for Brian. When a person is not compensating well, the feelings of inferiority are revealed in certain behaviors that Adler believed to be symptomatic of an uncompensated inferiority complex. Someone with an inferiority complex, Adler explained, will present as shy, indecisive, submissive, cowardly, and generally unsure. While a person with this complex may have poor self-image, they will become obsessively self-centered, focusing on their perceived imperfections. As an abused child, Brian recalled, I learned my playing kept my dad at bay. It drew people to me, made them like me, and at the same time, I didn't have to deal with them. In my life, Brian explained, being scared has been probably the most driving force that I have. Because I'm so afraid of life and the people in it, I gotta go through that. You push harder, you know? You fight better and you get more successful. That's what I did anyway. If an inferiority complex is undercompensated, the individual will have feelings of low self-worth, low self-esteem, resulting in a lack of confidence. Almost everyone who knew Brian has commented on his very poor sense of self, and the irony of these self-deprecatory feelings considering his massive talent and success. In high school, Brian recalled, I hung out with younger girls. I was friends with 14-year-olds when I was 17. I was friends with freshmen when I was a junior or senior. That way I could make sure they would look up to me. Another way to avoid competitive situations or interactions is to give in too easily, conforming to other people's views rather than defending one's own, or being too willing to appease others by acquiescing rather than expressing a personal view that diverges. Brian's overly acquiescent disposition made him easy to take advantage of and manipulate, and he was all too aware of that as well, as he noted in a song he wrote called Guess I'm Dumb. In the song, recorded by Glenn Campbell in 1965, Brian wrote, I'll give in when I know I should be strong. I'll give in even though I know it's wrong. I guess I'm dumb, but I don't care. Brian's issues with competition made it impossible for him to truly enjoy and appreciate the music of others, though it did fuel his compensatory need to make great music. When I hear really fabulous material by other groups, Brian said, I feel as small as the dot over the I in knit. Then I just have to create a new song to bring me on top. That's probably my most compelling motive for writing new songs, the urge to overcome an inferiority feeling. Adler suggested that people with undercompensated inferiority complexes may tend to have feelings of being persecuted, as a way of redirecting the roots of inferiority outwardly, blaming others for their own weaknesses. Brian suffered from a persecution complex that began with his father. I was afraid of my dad, Brian admitted. I wrestled with the fear that if I didn't hold myself together, despite how I felt, my dad's haunting criticism would be proved right. I would be a loser. As Brian's mental condition worsened in his 20s and 30s, his persecutors grew in numbers to include his brothers, bandmates, managers, bodyguards, psychiatrists, and even to completely delusionary persecutory figures, such as Phil Spector. Maybe the worst thing about my dad, Brian said, was how he dealt with my fear. He couldn't deal with it. Whenever I got afraid, he would yell at me or slap me or call me a pussy. An undercompensated inferiority complex is exacerbated by a parent with a superiority complex, who will unconsciously adopt a hypercritical attitude towards anyone perceived as a competitor, even if that competitor is your son, and even if that hypercriticism destroys your son's self-esteem. Brian recalled that after his first hit with the Beach Boys, Surfin', in 1961, my dad was so goddamn jealous of what I was able to achieve that he wasn't able to utter a single compliment. Nothing was ever good enough for him, and as a result, nothing was ever good enough for me. I spent a lifetime trying to prove him wrong, but it's been impossible to escape his stinging criticism. When Murray realized that he was nowhere near as talented as his own son, his narcissism was wounded, and he lashed out. My brain naturally thought in six-part harmony, Brian said, a pattern so complex not even my dad could understand it. The self-destructive nature of overcompensation is epitomized in Murry Wilson. When teenage Brian and his fledgling band were just starting out, Murry assumed a managerial position over the Beach Boys without even discussing it with them. Since the boys were minors, and since Murry did have a bit of valuable experience in the music business, the arrangement seemed fine at first. Certainly Brian, who was still just a kid, and who knew better than to ever refuse Murry, wasn't going to disagree. He pressured Brian to have the Beach Boys record a couple of his songs, which Brian knew to be inferior to his own. In 1962, he bullied Brian into co-forming a music publishing company that held the rights to all of Brian's compositions. The deal allowed Murry to take 50% of the publishing income from the Beach Boys songs and gave him control over publishing rights. As the pressure from Murry and of being the leader of one of the biggest rock bands in the world mounted on young Brian's shoulders, his nerves began to crack. At times he would suddenly fall apart, especially if he was drunk or stoned. During one of their early European tours, Brian had a meltdown one night after a show. The boys were out drinking, celebrating a successful concert date, when Brian suddenly melted down, crying uncontrollably to his brothers, "I'm so fucked up, and it's all Dad's fault. I'm never going to be fine, because Dad made me take a shit on the newspaper." One day in early 1964, as Brian and the boys were working in the studio, Murray's verbal bullying and physical abuse pushed Brian too far, and Brian screamed back in anger. "You were fired as manager of the Beach Boys." That simple statement, screamed out in anger without forethought, was cathartic for Brian. It felt so good, and the decision was so lauded by his bandmates and everyone else involved with the band, that he stuck to his decision. Murry was out. Soon afterwards, Brian's mother found out that Murry was cheating on her, and she asked him to leave the house. They would eventually separate and divorce. Rejected by both his sons and his wife, Murry fell into a deep depression. When he recovered, he came back with a vengeance. Late 1964, Murry demanded sole ownership of Sea of Tunes, the publishing company that held copyright ownership over all of Brian's songs. Brian was in a fragile mental state at that time, which Murry knew all too well. According to Brian, his father was gaslighting him, making him doubt his own sanity by stating repeatedly, day after day after day, that Brian had made an oral agreement with him years earlier, a promise to give his share of Sea of Tunes to Murry by 1965. Brian knew he never made such an agreement. Who would? But Murry kept pressuring him relentlessly, using legal maneuvers to block payment to Brian of hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties. The Beach Boys were making a fortune at that time off of album royalties and concerts, so in order to put an end to the constant harassment, Brian allowed Murry to take the income from the Sea of Tunes as a sort of pension for his father, for his help in getting the band started, but Brian refused to give up ownership of his songs. Murry kept at it though, relentlessly hounding his son and insisting that Brian had promised him ownership of the company, knowing that Brian, in his increasingly fragile mental state, may start to doubt his own memory. Brian never relented. 5 years later, in 1969, in the depths of psychosis, drug addiction, and depression, Brian was still able to cling to his former glory. Anything in the world comforted me, it was knowing I had my songs, the fruit of 6 years of being tapped into a motherlode of musical riches. I knew they'd always be there to protect me, as a cushion for any crisis, a reminder of who I was, perhaps a source of inspiration for what I might still become. In any event, those songs were my children, and I treasured that I owned them. In 1969, at a personal low point, Brian was further devastated when he heard the news that his father was selling Sea of Tunes for $700,000. Brian knew that the songs were worth much more than that, but Murry insisted that the Beach Boys were washed up, and that they would never get more than that amount for their music. He had taken the only thing that we knew would last, our songs, Brian moaned, and he sold it off like he was running a garage sale. He might as well have given the songs away. Today, that catalog is valued at more than $40 million. The inferiority complex, according to Adler, is usually first experienced in early childhood, when a child feels inferior in some way to his sibling, who is perceived as getting more parental affection and attention than he. Dennis the Menace, as he was referred to by friends and neighbors, got extra attention from his father in the form of vicious beatings, so it's unlikely that there was much sibling rivalry in the house over Murray's attention. Carl, the baby, seemed to focus more on avoiding attention, not so much as a form of compensation, but as a survival strategy. Once the Beach Boys were formed, the Wilson family drama was recast into the family dynamics of the band, a band of brothers. Though not everyone in the band was technically a Wilson brother. In the Beach Boys, Brian's most potent rival surfaced in the form of his cousin, Mike Love. Mike was the son of Murry Wilson's sister, Emily. A year older than Brian, Mike knew his cousin very well, as they lived nearby and he would visit on holidays. The Beach Boys essentially emerged out of the family sing-alongs Brian would orchestrate during family get-togethers. From the beginning, Brian and Mike never particularly liked each other. I both envied and felt intimidated by my cousin Mike Love. Tall and blond, he exuded confidence and swagger. He had a big ego. He wasn't especially nice. I looked at him and knew I couldn't measure up. I'd hear my dad's voice remind me, "You're a loser." In the early seminal years of the group, Brian was the acknowledged leader of the Beach Boys. But when Brian eventually dropped out of touring with the group, and when he later dropped out of life in general, Mike, as lead singer and frontman, became both the face and the voice of the group, and eventually grasped more and more control over the band's music and business affairs. As one of Brian's principal rivals, it's quite likely that Brian projected some of his feelings of inadequacy onto his relationship with Mike, setting up Mike as a bullying figure, much like Murray. An infamous incident from 1964 provides some insight into the troubled relationship between Mike and Brian. At the time, the Beach Boys were at the height of their popularity and were touring around the country to support their best-selling albums. Brian was under an enormous amount of pressure and in a very fragile state of mind. As he and the band's entourage were at the LA airport waiting for a flight, Brian snapped. "I saw something that fed into my insecurities," Brian recalled. "It was Mike and Marilyn. They were looking at each other affectionately, gazing into each other's eyes. I thought Mike wanted to fuck my wife. And the way Marilyn returned his look, she appeared to want that too. That's what I told myself, anyway." Brian had married his girlfriend, Marilyn, just a few days earlier. Though Marilyn was just 15 years old when she and Brian began dating, and only 17 when they married, Brian rested a lot of his psychological baggage on Marilyn's young shoulders. Marilyn, Brian said, had become the caring, loving mother I never had. Though Mike Love was a notorious womanizer, it seems rather preposterous that Mike would actually try to seduce Brian's newlywed wife at the airport, right in front of Brian and the whole Wilson family. Mike had plenty of young women who were more than open to his affections, and Marilyn was simply not his type. Brian's insecurities had festered into paranoia bordering on psychosis. While his bandmates were able to get Brian onto the plane, once he was seated, he had a total meltdown. He had to be physically restrained by his brothers for the entire flight, until the plane landed in Houston. It was such a nightmare that Brian stopped touring with the Beach Boys altogether. Freed from touring, Brian focused on studio recording from 1965 onwards, and he also began experimenting with drugs. In 1967, while working on the album Smile, Brian began to lose it. Brian later admitted, "LSD had shattered my mind." Brian recalls of the smile sessions. I refused to let Siegel inside to watch. After convincing myself that his wife was a witch who was using ESP to confuse my brain, I quit going to the studio. I sat in the house, closing the door on my family, my friends, and my music, and let myself begin to slip into the dark recesses of a depression that knew no bounds. After an infamous studio session for a track called Fire, Brian believed that a sudden spike in fires in downtown LA was directly caused by the hellish music he was conjuring in the studio. Terrified by this prospect, he destroyed the tapes and vowed never to record or play the music again. To avoid the stress of working with strangers in the studio, Brian refused to work outside of his home, where he had a massive sandbox installed in his living room, placing his grand piano inside of it, so he could feel the sand on his feet as he played, apparently to get him back in touch with the California beach sound he'd invented years earlier. Brian was also increasingly paranoid about his father. He thought Murray was planting bugs in his studio, home, and car to spy at his personal life and recordings. As a result, Brian demanded that all important discussions, personal or business, must take place in the pool in his backyard. Brian would panic if he was told Murray was coming to visit, sometimes vomiting in fear. He paid a private detective agency to professionally debug his house and his car. The voices, Brian recalled, began in 1964. They first came to me when I was 22, after I took LSD. The first time I took it, I had to go hide in a bedroom, and I thought mostly about my parents and whether I should be afraid of them. I also started to play what became California Girls on the piano. About a week after that, the first voices started to pop up. They'd sound like a real person's voice, a person different from me who I couldn't control, but inside my own head. My dad's voice, telling me I was weak. The other voices, the ones that tell me I'm worthless. By mid-1967, Brian was always high on something. Marijuana, cocaine, speed, psychedelics, alcohol. He was also chain-smoking cigarettes, drinking gallons of coffee each day, and binge-eating as much food as he can get his hands on. The tapes for the Smile album, which only Brian understood, had to be junked once the Beach Boys and their management realized that Brian was in no state to complete it. A complete replacement album was thrown together in the makeshift studio built in Brian's house, as the furthest he would ever venture from his room at that point was the boundaries of his own home. Smiley Smile was released in Smile's place. While Mike Love and Carl Wilson and the Beach Boys sailed around the world touring and took more of a lead role in recording, Brian was beached in a sandpit of depression, psychosis, and substance abuse. He spent most of his days in his room, rarely leaving his home. Any recording that he was involved with had to be done at his house. But recording for the Beach Boys was something that Brian was only able or willing to do very occasionally and very sporadically. In those days, I was content to live inside myself, he recalled, a withdrawn mass of misery and confusion and fear. To keep his demons at bay, Brian entertained a host of odd obsessions and engaged in bizarre compulsive rituals, such as eating steak for every meal, walking around his pool hundreds of times in a row, or blasting Phil Spector's Be My Baby or George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue at top volume on the stereo for hours and hours on end. By the end of the 1960s, Brian's household included his wife and two baby daughters, making his odd, self-destructive behavior and rampant drug abuse a serious problem for everyone around him. In the 1970s, Brian spent his days chain-smoking joints and cigarettes, gorging on entire cakes and vats of ice cream, and perpetually sedating himself with drugs and alcohol to the point of complete degradation. After Murray died in 1973, Brian's debauched and labile condition nosedived into a deep depression, during which he tried to kill himself by driving off a cliff. He also had a grave dug for himself in his backyard, but couldn't find anyone willing to kill Brian and bury him in it. His self-destructive drug abuse reached a level that seemed suicidal. I was schizoid, he admitted, Perceptions and pictures that entered my head were translated into codes only I understood, distorted and fractured into cubist interpretations of reality. My mind was a hyperactive house of thrills vacillating between numbness and panic, paranoia and terror. At the end of the decade, he was morbidly obese and in failing health. Oftentimes he was found wandering around Sunset Boulevard in the dead of night, drunk and stoned, still in his bathrobe and slippers, staggering carelessly into traffic. By 1979, Marilyn had had enough. She divorced Brian, who was forced to leave his home and live alone in a rented house. Though the Beach Boys management provided supervision for Brian, he was still quite unhinged. He would pace endlessly around his pool. His right leg would shake constantly, and he began talking only out of the side of his mouth, a strange habit that persisted from that point through the rest of his life. Not long after moving into his own house, following some violent self-destructive behavior, Brian was involuntarily committed to the psychiatric ward of Brotman Memorial Hospital, where he stayed for several months. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, Brian was hospitalized many times for mental illness, substance abuse, and other medical and psychiatric issues. Eugene Landy was born in Pittsburgh in 1934. From an early age, he harbored a lifelong ambition to be in the music business, but he had no musical talent whatsoever. After working in the peripheries of the pop music scene for years, he found a back door into the heart of the industry by studying psychology, moving to LA, and becoming a therapist who specialized in working with musicians struggling with substance abuse. He enters Brian's story at the end of 1975, when Marilyn, desperate to help Brian and save her family, contacted the Shrink to the Stars. By that point, Landy had developed an extremely radical method of therapy that involved taking total control and authority over his client's life. Landy's methods were experimental, his results dubious, and his reputation tainted, but Marilyn saw little room for alternatives. Either she finds somebody to really help Brian, a prospect that seemed to necessitate an extreme and experimental methodology, or they commit Brian to a psychiatric hospital against his will and keep him there indefinitely, or he was going to die. The therapeutic relationship between Landy and Brian contained many ironic parallels with Brian's terribly troubled relationship with his father. The irony, however, makes sense. If Brian's psychiatric troubles stemmed from an abusive relationship with his father, then possibly the only thing that could cure him is a relationship that mirrored the one between Murray and Brian, but which steered Brian towards sanity rather than insanity. The logic here, I suppose, is similar to the logic seen in a cartoon show, in which a character develops amnesia after receiving a blow to the head. The only way to restore the character's memory is by inflicting another blow to the head. Obviously, the logic is flawed, and it also begs the question, even if the treatment is effective, is it ethical, and is it possibly causing more harm than good? The only person I'd ever really listened to before was my dad, Brian explained. I listened to him solely because he made me. He beat me. He threatened me with pain. He tortured me psychologically. I never cared what anyone else had to say because I was preoccupied with my own voices and with the music I heard inside my head. It was far more interesting, far more exciting. Lo and behold, Landy comes into my life and he has the same power. He beat me too. He beat me at my own Scrabble game in my head. Like Murry Wilson, Landy always wanted to be in the music business. Like Murray, Landy forced his way into Brian's musical career. Taking advantage of Brian's fragility and passivity, Landy took over as Brian's manager. Seizing upon Brian's lack of self-confidence as a lyricist, he forced Brian to co-write songs with him, labeling it as a form of psychotherapy. Even though Landy insisted that the songs be recorded and placed on a solo album he forced Brian to make, and even though Landy received co-authorship credit as well as publishing and royalty monies. Landy made himself a co-producer on Brian's solo album and supervised the writing of his autobiography, Wouldn't It Be Nice, published in 1992, which paints an unrealistically rosy picture of Landy as an eccentric and altruistic genius. The book is copyrighted by the Landy Wilson Production Company, which he named Brains and Genius, with the following dedication: to Dr. Eugene Landy. Without you, there'd be no music. Brian Wilson. Landy bribed Brian with cheeseburgers and milkshakes to compose songs and to use Landy's lyrics instead of his own. Landy even forced Brian to allow Landy's girlfriend, Alexandra Morgan, to write lyrics for Brian's songs, for which she received songwriting credits as well as publishing and royalty revenue. Lawsuits later filed by Brian's family and friends against Landy revealed that Landy was taking an unfair percentage of these dubiously gained royalties. From the beginning of the therapy, Brian recalls that Landy reminded me of my dad, a therapeutic transference that Landy encouraged. The construct of transference holds that in a therapeutic relationship, the client will naturally project his feelings towards his mother or father onto the therapist. Transference is seen as a positive thing because parents are usually supportive, nurturing, and caring. However, if a parent is abusive and cruel, it's not a very good idea to elicit transference, but that's exactly what Landy did. Methods could be violent, Brian recalled. Sometimes that reminded me of my dad, which seemed wrong. It was wrong for him to feel like a father when he was worse in every way. He was angrier, he was more unfair. I had no idea if there was any love to go along with the anger. Like Brian's mother, Marilyn gave up on being personally responsible for Brian's mental health, passing on the responsibility to a father figure who was brutal and abusive, and then turning a blind eye to the abuse, all the while rationalizing, this is probably all for Brian's own good. A scene from a benefit dinner in San Francisco for the Joffrey Ballet seemed to replay the infamous shit incident between Brian and his father. Landy forced Brian to go to the dinner, even though Brian at that point was terrified of leaving his house. At the dinner, Brian had a panic attack and begged to go home. Landy refused. "But I'm going to throw up if I don't go," Brian said. In response, Landy jumped up from the table and shouted, "If you're going to do it, do it. Do it here." He pounded on the table. Throw up, throw up. If you're going to throw up, do it. Do it here and now on the table for everyone to see." The people at the table, including Mo Austin, the mayor of San Francisco, and Mr. Joffrey himself, were shocked and disgusted. Everyone in the restaurant turned to look, aghast. Brian had no choice but to sit down and finish his dinner. Dr. Landy always said, "There's only room in each head for one crazy person," and he maintained that he could be crazier than me. If Dr. Landy acted crazier than me, then I had to either get sane or get crazier than Dr. Landy. It was no contest. He guaranteed that he could be crazier than me because he was saner than me. If all of this seems like utter nonsense to you, you're probably right. Peter Carlin, one of Brian's many biographers, explained that as much as Brian resented Landy's relentless control over his life, being forced to answer to an aggressive, demanding authority figure also felt familiar, and as much as he might have hated to admit it, comfortable. Just like Murray had once done, Landy gave Brian boundaries and expectations. Landy was able to bully Brian into working in the studio, and he even got Brian to start playing on stage with the Beach Boys again. Landy used brutal fear tactics and 24/7 supervision to keep all drugs, alcohol, and unhealthy foods well out of Brian's reach. By 1976, Brian was losing weight and getting physically stronger, and he was off the booze and the drugs and all the other toxic intoxicants. But at what price? Landy realized that he could get Brian to do anything he wanted him to do. He also realized that while he controlled Brian completely, he had no control over the other Beach Boys, which is why Landy bullied Brian into recording his first solo album. A studio administrator recalled of Landy, he used to go out of his way to embarrass Brian. I remember he had a young kid working for him, and I remember seeing him standing over Brian with a fucking baseball bat, like, "If you don't knuckle down and do what we want, I'm going to hit you with the bat." Dr. Landy was a tyrant who controlled one person, Brian said, and that person was me. He controlled where I went and what I did and who I saw and what I ate. He controlled it by spying on me. He controlled it by having other people spy on me. He controlled it by screaming at me. He controlled it by stuffing me full of drugs that confused me. If you help a person to get better by erasing that person, what kind of job have you done? Despite Landy's brutal methods, what got him fired after 14 months of treatment was not his abuse of Brian's mind and body, but his abuse of Brian's bank account. Landy was charging Brian up to $20,000 in monthly fees for his therapeutic services and the help of his staff. Even though there was a large staff of attendants who monitored Brian around the clock to make sure he wasn't doing any substances or overeating, the fees were beyond exorbitant. $20,000 in 1976 is equivalent to about $100,000 in today's money. The manager of the Beach Boys, who oversaw the income and expenditures for all of the group members, gawked at the exorbitant fees and immediately called Landy, who proposed in response that he be paid with a percentage of Brian's monthly earnings rather than an hourly rate, an unheard of proposal for any therapist to make. It was the money issue that led to Landy's first dismissal in 1976. Unfortunately, without the 24/7 supervision of Landy's attendants and without the fearful, bullying presence of Landy himself, Brian slipped back into his old ways. By 1982, Brian tipped the scales at a hefty 340 pounds, and he was still gaining. His insatiable appetite for food, alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs such as marijuana, heroin, and cocaine made him a ticking time bomb for a fatal heart attack. Following a nearly fatal overdose of alcohol and cocaine, Brian's imminent mortality was the motivation for getting Landy back. For as much as his friends and family hated Landy as a person and derided him as a therapist, his extreme methods were the only thing that he had ever worked to get Brian clean and healthy. Landy agreed to return, but on the condition that he be given complete control over every aspect of his patient's physical, personal, social, and sexual environments. Landy, in other words, would be Brian's all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing father. Brian's family and friends seemed to have little choice. Either they rehire Landy, or Brian would die. Brian was glad to be free of his second abusive father, Eugene Landy, and could not be convinced to willingly return to Landy's care. As a result, his family, friends, and business managers played a trick on him. On November 5th, 1982, Brian was informed by his lawyer that he had been fired from the Beach Boys, and he was also notified by his accountant that he was completely broke and owed $80,000 in back taxes. This was all a ploy, because Brian was told that the firing and the resultant financial insolvency were both reversible upon the condition that Brian go back into treatment with Landy. In 1983, Landy moved into Brian's house and had Brian move into a new house that was fully staffed with helpers, attendants, and bodyguards. Brian would be required to wear a beeper so Landy could summon him to the nearest telephone at any time of the day or night. Landy immediately inserted himself into every aspect of Brian's life, including Brian's role as a beach boy. I influence all of his thinking, Landy told California Magazine in 1984. I'm practically a member of the band. In another interview, Landy boasted that he and Brian were partners in life. We've exchanged names. He's Brian Landy Wilson, and I'm Eugene Wilson Landy. What Landy was so brazenly bragging about is a construct referred to in the field of psychology as enmeshment, a parent-child relationship sometimes recapitulated in therapy via transference, in which personal boundaries between the therapist and the client are dissolved, so that the client loses all sense of personal autonomy. The client becomes inextricably enmeshed in the therapist's psyche, sacrificing his own sense of self and becoming a mere extension of his controller's more powerful force of will. Salvador Minuchin, who coined the term, referred to enmeshment as a form of psychic incest. In 1986, Brian confided to his old friend and former bandmate, Gary Usher, "I'm living in a strange hell. I'm a prisoner and I have no hope of escaping." He said that he attempted suicide the previous summer by jumping off a boat in the middle of the ocean and swimming away into the open sea, but even that couldn't disentangle him from his Svengali strings. To strengthen his client's enmeshment with himself, Landy cut Brian off from his family and friends, arguing that these people were negative influences linked to Brian's unhealthy past. Landy disallowed contact from Brian's mother, daughters, brother, and ex-wife, as well as anyone else he considered to be a bad influence on Brian. Landy also used psychiatric medication to control Brian's mind, keeping him in a drug-induced haze in which he couldn't remember anything and would often fall asleep in mid-conversation. Other symptoms of Brian's overmedication on psychiatric drugs were the appearance of facial tics, his perpetual waxen expression, and his trembling hands and legs. Probable symptoms of tardive dyskinesia, which are side effects of antipsychotic medication, especially if they're overmedicated. Landy referred to the medication as vitamins. He had me on lots of medications, Ryan recalls. I wasn't sure I needed all of them, but some of the ones I was taking prevented me from saying anything about the other ones. In 1986, Brian began dating Melinda Ledbetter, but when their relationship began to blossom, Landy perceived Melinda as a threat to his control, so he forced Brian to stop seeing her. In response to her exclusion from Brian's life, Melinda got in touch with Carl Wilson and Brian's mother, and instigated an investigation and lawsuit that would eventually oust Landy from Brian's life. The investigation revealed that Landy started out charging $25,000 a month for treatment in 1982, but the monthly bill kept increasing, up to $30,000 in the late 80s, up to $35,000 in the early 90s, eventually going up to nearly $40,000 a month. The bills were so high that Brian couldn't pay them from his regular earnings, so Landy began getting paid directly from Brian's royalties. Landy was also living for free in Brian's Pacific Palisades house, which he was remodeling with Brian's money. Landy took lavish vacations with his family in Hawaii, where Brian was being treated, charging it all to Brian's treatment fees. The charges mounted against Landy by the Wilson family and the California Board of Medical Quality Assurance included charges made by another patient, a woman who alleged that Landy had given her illegal drugs such as cocaine and that he coerced her into having sex with him. Landy pleaded the Fifth Amendment at the civil suit trial for those charges. As for the charges made on behalf of the Wilson family, Landy was accused of creating dual, triple, and quadruple relationships that caused severe emotional damage, psychological dependency, and financial exploitation to his patient. The court determined that Landy used Brian's vulnerable state of mind and pliable nature to manage Brian's career to his own personal benefit. To protect his control, he isolated Brian, over-medicated him, and brainwashed him until he lacked any will of his own. A victim of his own sense of inferiority, Brian was all too willing to subjugate his own ego to the force of a seemingly more powerful and superior force of personality. In 1989, the California Board of Medical Quality Assurance ordered Landy to surrender his license to practice psychotherapy in California, which did nothing to interfere with Landy's control over Brian's life. Landy asserted in interviews that he had ceased being Brian's therapist and that they were now creative and business partners, and the production company called Brains and Genius. They were collaborating on a new album, an autobiographical book, and a $100 million lawsuit against a record company that illegitimately bought the publishing rights for all of his songs from Murry Wilson back in 1969. In 1992, Carl Wilson initiated a lawsuit on behalf of the Wilson family that resulted in a restraining order barring Landy from having any contact with Brian. Once Landy lost control over Brian, he left the state of California and practiced in New Mexico and Hawaii until his death in 2006. In the early 1990s, after Landy was forcibly separated from Brian by court decree, he gave an accounting of the millions of dollars he received in fees from Brian over the previous 8 years of service. Landy charged, on average, $35,000 a month for his and his staff's services. Landy also negotiated a deal in 1984 to receive 25% of Brian's earnings for every new song he wrote or produced. Landy also charged $300,000 a year for acting as Brian's business manager, on top of an additional $150,000 a year he received for representing Brian as a member of the Beach Boys at their record company's corporate meetings. The coup de grace was the revelation that Landy had somehow been designated in Brian's revised will as the primary beneficiary of his estate. When Brian died, he would have received 70% of Brian's vast fortune. In 1992, the Superior Court of Santa Monica ordered Landy to remove himself from the musician's life and to dissolve all financial and personal ties with Brian Wilson. The day after the ruling, Brian called his producer and colleague, Andy Paley, to say, "I can do anything I want to now. Let's make some music." Comparing his relationship with Landy to his relationship with his father, Brian noted, "Both of them liked to put themselves in charge of me and tell me what was best for me. But my dad loved me. He loved all of us. Helping us with the band benefited him. He got profits, but he wasn't only interested in the profit. Dr. Landy seemed at one point to be only interested in the profit, in getting his name on my songs and taking credit and taking money and getting his name on my legal papers. Landy might have helped me a little bit, might have helped so that I didn't sink lower and maybe even out of sight, but it was far outweighed by all the horrible things he did. When my dad died in 1973, it really knocked me down. When Dr. Landy died in 2006, I heard the news and sat and thought about it for a while, and then I just got back to work." Brian thrived in the post-Landy years. He got a new psychiatrist who changed his meds and put him on much lower dosages so that his psychiatric symptoms were addressed while not turning him into a dazed, confused, trembling zombie. He married Melinda in 1995, and they went on to adopt 5 children. After reestablishing his relationships with his estranged adult daughters, Carney and Wendy Wilson, who had become successful singer-songwriters in their own rights, Brian and his daughters began collaborating on music projects, reconnecting on multiple levels. In 2004, Brian finally completed the album that had derailed him nearly 40 years earlier, Smile, now entitled Brian Wilson Presents Smile. Note the normal capitalization in the word smile on the album cover. The reconceptualized album was received with wide acclaim by both critics and fans alike. Brian Wilson turned 82 years old in 2024. He lives in California with his wife and children and continues to record and play live.